A blanket of white snow covered the entire base perimeter. Through the razor wire fence, wind howled with a sound like grinding teeth held clenched far too long. Assembled in formation for the operational briefing stood the team members, their dark boots contrasting sharply against white drifts while frozen breath escaped in wispy strands. When the commander read through the mission roster, one particular name got struck from the list. Sarah Mitchell's name. No explanation came from Commander Jack Reynolds. His only instruction was for her to remain at base. Immediate protests erupted from the others. She possessed the finest marksmanship skills, maintained composure under the most intense pressure, and could read landscape features as clearly as if they were drawn on paper. At just 20 years old, she'd already proven herself the steadiest operator they had. What possible reason existed to bench their strongest asset precisely when her skills were most critical? Sarah offered no argument, not even a blink. She simply adjusted her pack strap as though securing something irreplaceable inside. Later that evening, inside the equipment storage room, the team went searching for explanations and discovered her personal journal. When the first page fell open, complete silence filled the space. The briefing area consisted of a long concrete rectangle lit by harsh fluorescent tubes. A topographical ridge map lay spread across the central table. The mission objective appeared straightforward on paper. Travel to the distant valley and retrieve a damaged sensor pod. Confirm absence of enemy observation. Complete the return journey before darkness fell. The major challenge involved the route itself. 2 narrow passage points existed, along with a basin offering terrible visibility and a corridor practically designed for ambush scenarios. Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell positioned herself at the table's edge, hands clasped behind her back in regulation stance, though her eyes remained locked on that map with intense focus. Despite her young age, she'd earned that sergeant rank through performance nobody could question. Across from her stood Captain Jack Reynolds, one finger tracing their primary movement corridor while he detailed potential hazards. Clustered around them stood the remaining team members. Tom Harrison handling point duties, Marcus Webb, their medic, Kyle Fisher managing communications, plus the 2 recent additions, Rifleman Ryan Cole and Ben Carter. From the mission's initial conception, Sarah's participation had been fundamental to every calculation. She'd accurately predicted wind behavior patterns in that basin the previous winter season. She possessed this remarkable ability to interpret snow patterns and shadow placement into a navigational map invisible to others. Reynolds placed complete faith in that particular talent, and the rest of the unit relied upon it. Within their tactical framework, her assigned position had been absolute, providing overwatch coverage from the eastern ridgeline, acting as a steady counterbalance to the team's inclination toward rushing through whiteout conditions. When the commander announced the roster, his vocal tone remained unchanged throughout. Sarah's name was conspicuously absent. No dramatic pause followed. He simply scanned the formation and directed her to stay behind at base. His words came out clipped and absolute, like a door slamming shut against a howling storm. Objections filled the air without delay. Tom raised the numerical issue. 6 operators already represented a skeleton crew for Valley operations, and removing 1 member transformed it into a serious gamble. Marcus highlighted the time constraint. Kyle voiced what everyone else was thinking. The entire route had been designed specifically around Sarah's overwatch capabilities, and altering the plan at this stage meant completely rebuilding everything. Reynolds refused to engage in debate. He merely repeated the directive. Stay behind. Sarah maintained her at-ease posture, weight distributed evenly across both boots, gaze directed forward, her jaw set in an expression both flat and impossible to interpret. She raised no objection. She simply accepted it, and that acceptance proved even more infuriating to the team than the actual order itself. Tom spoke up again, his voice escalating. If Sarah wasn't going on this operation, he would refuse to deploy. Reynolds held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds before informing him the mission would proceed with or without his cooperation. In that loaded silence, the command hierarchy reasserted itself within that room. Sarah tightened her pack strap once more and stepped away from the map table. Reynolds' attention never wavered from those grid coordinates. The team filed toward the exit, their boots creating echoing sounds. Sarah remained stationed near the doorway until the last person departed, then turned back into the facility. The door sealed behind her with a hollow metallic click that sounded disturbingly final. By midday, speculation had outpaced actual facts. Rumors circulated through the barracks and mess facility like an icy draft. Some claimed Sarah had been pulled due to disciplinary action. Others suggested she'd become unstable, too withdrawn following the previous deployment rotation. Someone mentioned that despite being only 20, she carried herself like someone much older, like someone who'd already seen too much. The medical technician referenced sleep deprivation. The radio communications specialist theorized she might have failed a psychological evaluation. Yet those with closest proximity to her said considerably less. They'd witnessed her performance on the firing range and in harsh weather conditions. They'd watched her isolate a human figure from complete whiteout conditions and maintain that breathless pause before squeezing the trigger. In the mess hall, Sarah sat isolated with a coffee mug that had long since gone cold. She consumed her meal in measured portions, eyes fixed on the courtyard visible beyond the window panes. She didn't glance up when people spoke her name aloud. One specific detail circulated quietly among personnel: the particular way Reynolds had looked at Sarah, as though observing a wound that never properly healed, and knowing precisely where the scar tissue would separate under pressure. It wasn't a look conveying distrust. It was the expression of someone who comprehended the cost of allowing something to fracture at the wrong moment. By the time the team loaded into the transport, their frustration had settled into something steady rather than explosive. After the transport departed, the barracks shifted into a different operational rhythm. Sarah sat alone at a corner table, cleaning dust from a lens set. Not because they needed cleaning, but because the motion kept her hands occupied and steady. Sarah maintained her routine on departure day and the days following. She rose before dawn broke, ran the perimeter circuit, and put rounds through range targets with steady, measured rhythm. Her shooting form was textbook perfect. If performance indicated mental health, she appeared the strongest among them, but the subtle details surrounding her were quieter and more difficult to identify. It was a corporal working in the armory who noticed the mark on her wrist. He spotted it when she signed out a replacement scope. It was a thin line, pale against her skin, the type of scar left by a cord pulled too tight or a blade held too close. Beside it was a faint, deliberate symbol: 2 parallel lines crossed by a short diagonal slash. Another teammate observed her writing in a small, dark notebook after drills concluded. Marcus Webb, the medic, noticed how she rubbed her hands together in the brief intervals between firing sequences. He watched the way her eyes darted left every time wind whistled through the tower cables. She moved through the base like someone keeping a silent promise. At night, David Stone passed by once on the late shift and saw a thin line of light beneath her door. When he knocked, she answered that she was writing. The tone in her voice made it clear the words were not meant for sharing. For someone so young, she carried herself with the weight of someone far older. The communications room became a kind of refuge. Sarah took extra shifts there, listening to the static between transmissions. She logged each update with the same precision she used for range data. The team departed at first light, their tracks a thin scar across the untouched snow. In the basin, they couldn't see more than 30 yards ahead. Without Sarah, Tom tried to fill the gap, scanning deeper than he was trained to, lingering too long on empty sectors. Their pace slowed, the schedule tightened. They hit the first choke point later than planned. In the basin, the wind shifted and the snow came hard, reducing the world to a moving wall. The team veered slightly off the plotted route. A faint set of tracks appeared, half buried. No one could tell if they were fresh or old. They chose to proceed, and the choice felt heavier than it should have. They reached the sensor pod late, its casing iced over. The retrieval took longer because the locking pin had frozen. By the time they turned back, daylight had thinned to a blue hue, and the wind came harder from the east. They were behind schedule, moving faster now, missing details that would have been obvious to Sarah. The absence was not just a missing person. It was a missing pattern in their movement, a missing rhythm in their pace. A thin line of tracks crossed their path, almost erased by spindrift. Tom knelt, brushed the snow away, and couldn't tell how old it was. The tracks didn't match their own. The team's angles were wrong. They had pushed too far toward the tree line. The terrain that had looked harmless from a map had become the kind of terrain that punished anyone who misread it. Back at base, the people who remained watched the weather and waited. It was the medic who suggested looking through her gear. Marcus had been the one to watch her hand tremble after the artillery in the mountains, and he couldn't shake the sense that Reynolds had issued the order with a reason he would never say. Kyle, the radio specialist, agreed. David Stone, the quartermaster, hesitated, then opened Sarah's locker with the same slow motion he used on a sealed crate. Her pack was stowed neatly. The notebook was at the bottom, wrapped in a field cloth as if it needed protecting. No one expected to find a journal in a rifleman's pack. They didn't open it immediately. There was a pause long enough to hear the wind rattle the metal siding. Then David turned the first page. The writing was tight, controlled, and sparse, like a report written for a file. Dates were listed, times were noted, locations were grid accurate. Yet between the lines, there was something raw, a fault line that ran just below the surface. Kyle read the entries out loud in a low voice. The notebook didn't reveal itself quickly. It asked for attention, and they gave it. The entry began with a timestamp and a temperature reading. It described a patrol 2 winters prior, a recon sweep through a valley that matched the one their team now moved through. She wrote that they entered the wrong corridor and exposed themselves to a firing lane they didn't know existed. She wrote that the first shot came from the left, low and fast, and the man at point went down before he could call it in. She'd been only 18 then, barely out of training. The journal recorded the sequence without flourish. 2 shots, a scramble, the medic hit, the commander down. She wrote about pulling a body by the strap of a vest, about feeling the strap cut into her hand, about the snow turning dark at her knees. She wrote that she thought she could hold the line alone, and was wrong. She wrote that the commander, this same commander, dragged her back to the extraction point. He had blood on his face and ice on his sleeves. She wrote that she swore on the ride out that she would never let the same mistake happen again, and that the vow had become a weight she carried like a second rifle. She wrote about waking in the night to the sound of wind and hearing gunfire in it. She wrote that her hand shook at the range when the cold was sharp enough to split the air. One line described her standing in the same briefing room they stood in now, watching a map, feeling the old corridor return under her feet. She wrote that the fear was not of death, but of repeating the same misread, the same fraction of a second that cost too much. The language was dry, but the cracks were visible. She wrote as if she were trying to keep her emotions from reaching the paper, but the effort itself was the sign that they were there. One entry broke its own pattern with a short list of procedural failures written like a checklist. Each line ended with a short dash, as if she intended to add a corrective measure, and then couldn't. She wrote that she carried the guilt in her shoulder like a pack she couldn't take off, and then crossed the line out and rewrote it as a note about load balance. The crossed-out ink remained, a shadow beneath the cleaner sentence. She recorded the names of the lost men once, and only once. They appeared in a narrow column on the right margin. The last line on the page was small and flat. It read, "If I go in broken, I break everyone with me." Marcus felt the words settle in his chest like a weight. David turned the page slowly, as if moving too quickly might tear something. The next entries connected to the present without naming it directly. Sarah noted a meeting with Reynolds 2 weeks before the current mission. She wrote that he told her the mission profile was too similar to the last one, and that he couldn't take the risk of her freezing in the wrong corridor. The journal made clear that he didn't doubt her skill. The risk was that the old memory would surface at the wrong moment and lock her in place, turning her into a still point while the team moved into fire. She wrote that he had offered her a choice: step back or be stepped back. She wrote that she understood why he had to order it publicly to protect the chain of command. The commander had said little, but the words she recorded were simple and final. He could carry their anger. He wouldn't carry their bodies. Sarah wrote that the look in his eyes had been the same as the look from the old extraction point. She was 20 years old, but she wrote like someone who understood the weight of command decisions. Kyle flipped ahead and found a later entry that said only one sentence: "If he had not been there last time, I would not be here to write this." The line was placed alone on the page. It carried the weight of an entire winter. The radio crackled that afternoon with a change in tone. The team reported movement, then static. The ridge line had turned into a shadowed maze. A line of trees that had looked empty now held heat, and the team had stepped into a shallow crossfire. They were not fully pinned, but they were pressed. Tom, who had argued in the briefing, tried to move the team forward with a quick rush. He took a round through the thigh and dropped. Tom called for suppressive fire, but their angles were poor. They couldn't see the shooters through the snow and the shadows. The valley swallowed the noise. Kyle heard their breathing. The open channel carried the thin sounds of effort. When the radio channel went quiet for 3 long seconds, Kyle felt a cold deeper than the weather. The response came as a short burst distorted by static. They were shifting to a defensive pocket. Tom said they needed time. Time was the one thing the wind didn't give. Sarah was not on the line, but she was not idle. When Kyle told her where the team had stalled, she went to the northern observation post that overlooked the basin. It was a narrow slab of concrete with a frozen scope and a line of sight that had been cut and cleared in the summer. The distance was long, but within her range. She set up the rifle, checked the wind, and took a slow breath. From the base, she could see the outline of the trees and the slight movement that betrayed the shooters. She didn't move as fast as she could have. She moved as precisely as she could. Her shot cut through the wind, and a small figure folded behind a trunk. She adjusted by a hair, fired again, and the pressure on the team eased. Kyle relayed her corrections, her instructions for a new route. She kept her voice minimal, all function, nothing else. She marked a gap in the tree line and told them to move when the wind gusted. They listened, they moved, the line loosened. She didn't leave the base. She didn't appear in their field of view, but her presence moved through their radios and through the sudden slack in the enemy fire. The team used her guidance to reach a rock outcropping that gave them cover. From there, they could see the shallow cut that led out of the basin. Ryan and Ben dragged Tom through the snow, the blood on his leg freezing at the edges. They moved when Sarah marked a pause in the incoming fire, and stopped when she warned that movement had shifted behind them. The extraction point was still a long distance away, but they had an exit now. The wind thickened, and the enemy fire thinned. The team kept moving, slow and steady, the line of their tracks bending toward safety. At the observation post, Sarah watched the small figures in the basin become smaller. She didn't allow herself to follow them with emotion. She followed them with calculation. She fired 2 more times as the team crossed the shallow cut. The shots were clean and spare. When the last figure crossed the line she had marked as safe, she let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She stood, cleared the rifle, and carried it back down the stairs. She returned to the communications room and wrote down the coordinates she had used, the timing of the wind shifts, the number of shots fired. But underneath the report was the fact that she had kept her team alive without stepping into the basin. The difference was not small. It was the difference Reynolds had been trying to secure. They came back after dark. Their faces were wind-bitten, their breath raw. Tom walked with a bandaged thigh. Reynolds met them in the yard. He didn't speak about the mission beyond a brief debrief. No one mentioned the journal. No one admitted to reading it. But their behavior shifted in ways that didn't need to be named. Tom, who had argued in the briefing, nodded once at Sarah when he passed. Ryan set her rifle in its rack without comment. Marcus placed her pack back in her locker, the notebook wrapped again in the field cloth as if it had never been opened. She found it later and didn't react. The team didn't apologize. Reynolds didn't justify himself. The silence between them was not empty. It was a shared understanding that had been paid for in cold and blood. In the following days, the base returned to its routines. The team moved through their tasks with a new economy, their anger stripped away by experience and replaced with a different kind of respect. It was quiet. A change in the way they moved around Sarah. A change in the way they looked at Reynolds when he spoke. After the review, Tom approached Sarah outside the armory. He didn't speak. He simply handed her a box of ammunition he had signed out for her. The gesture was quiet, almost formal. She accepted it without comment. The exchange took less than a minute, but it did what a speech couldn't. It reset a piece of trust without naming it. That week, the team ran a shortened night drill under Reynolds' supervision. Sarah stayed at the edge of the range and called the wind for them. The drill went clean. No errors, no wasted rounds. When it ended, Reynolds dismissed them with a short nod. Sarah continued to keep her journal. The entries didn't become softer, but they became more even. She wrote about the way Tom had nodded, about the way Ryan had set her rifle down without comment. She wrote about a moment in the yard when Reynolds looked at the horizon and then at her, and she understood that his silence had been a kind of protection. She wrote the final entry later when the base had settled and the wind had slackened. It was a short line, measured and plain. It said that strength was sometimes the decision not to step into the line, and that holding back could be its own kind of protection. She closed the notebook and slid it into her pack. Outside, the wind moved through the wire again. She listened to it for a moment, then turned off the light. The room went dark, but the quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. This story comes to you from Old Bill Tells, where every tale carries the weight of experience and the quiet truth of those who served. Dear viewers, I've launched a new channel where more of your favorite videos will be posted. To stay connected, head over and subscribe to Old Bill Tells. Please share the videos from that channel with your friends, and don't forget to like. Thank you. Honor to our veterans.